My name is Joanna. I was 34 years old, and I had driven up to my father's cabin outside a small Vermont town called Redfield Hollow to spend a week sorting through everything he left behind. He had passed away that spring, and my mother could not bring herself to go through his things, so it fell to me. I told myself it would be simple. Pack a few boxes, close up the cabin for the season, and drive home to Hartford before the weather turned. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road, almost a mile from the nearest neighbor. My father built it himself in the 60s, and it still had his handwriting on things. A fuse box labeled in pencil, a woodpile stacked the way he always stacked it, tight and square along the east wall. The woodpile sat behind the shed and could not be seen from the road or front porch. The telephone box was on the opposite side of the cabin, along the west wall beside the kitchen window. There was no television up there, just a radio, a wood stove, and a black rotary phone on the kitchen wall that my father paid extra to keep connected year-round in case we ever needed it. My own car was parked beside the front porch. My father's old pickup was still in the shed behind the cabin. I had started it twice that week while clearing things out, mostly because Dad had always told me never to let an old truck sit too long without running it. My husband and I had separated that January, and I had not told my mother yet, so part of me was glad for a reason to leave Hartford for a week. My apartment there felt too quiet in a different way, a way that made me restless rather than settled. The cabin, at least, had always been a place where quiet made sense. My father used to say a person could hear themselves think out there, and for the first 2 nights, I thought he was right. I spent my days boxing up his tools, his flannel shirts, and a coffee can full of nails sorted by size the way only he would bother sorting them. In the evenings, I sat on the porch with a cassette player I had brought along, listening through a pair of foam-covered headphones while the light dropped behind the trees. I also brought my father's old camera and a few rolls of film because I wanted some pictures of the property before we eventually let it go. By my 3rd night, the silence had started to feel less like peace and more like something I was alone inside of. That afternoon, I had walked down to check the mailbox at the end of the road, more out of habit than expectation since I had not told anyone at home to write. On the way back, I noticed tire tracks in the soft dirt near the turnoff. They came in from the old logging road rather than the main road and looked fresh enough that the edges had not yet softened. I assumed somebody had been using the old road and did not think much more about it. That was the night the storm came through. It started around 9, rain hammering the tin roof, wind pulling at the trees hard enough that I could hear branches cracking somewhere beyond the tree line. The power went out a little after 10. I lit 2 kerosene lamps my father kept under the sink and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, listening to the storm and telling myself it would pass by morning. Around 11, someone knocked on the door. I froze with the cup halfway to my mouth. Nobody knew I was up there except my mother, and she would never drive out in weather like this, especially at night. I went to the window first, the way my father always told me to. A man stood on the porch in a yellow rain slicker, soaked through, a flashlight in one hand. Behind him, near the edge of the clearing, I could just make out the dark shape of a truck sitting at an angle in the road with its lights off. He called through the door, "Sorry to bother you this late. Phone company. We had a report of interference on this line, and I wanted to check the box before the storm gets any worse." I did not open the door. I asked him how he knew anyone was up here at all since the cabin sat so far off the main road. He said, "Dispatch has the account on file. Whitfield residence. We had a call earlier tonight saying the line was cutting in and out. That should have been the moment I relaxed. He had my father's name right, but nobody had used our line to report anything that evening. I had been sitting 3 feet from that phone since dinner, and it had not rung once. I told him I would need to see some identification before I let him do anything. He held up a laminated card to the window, too wet and too dark for me to read. Then he said, "Storm's getting worse. I really just need 2 minutes at the box on the side of the house. I won't even have to come inside." I asked, "What company are you with?" He paused just slightly before answering. It was the kind of pause a person makes when they are choosing an answer instead of simply remembering one. He said, "I'm with a regional line crew. We cover places out this way when the regular crews can't." I had never heard of anything like that, but I had also never had a reason to know every crew that serviced rural telephone lines, so I let it go for the moment. I told him he could check the box outside, but I was not opening the door. He said that was fine. He moved off the porch and around the west side of the cabin. His flashlight beam bounced against the wet siding. I went straight to the kitchen phone and picked it up. There was a dial tone. The line was working perfectly. I dialed the operator, my hand shaking a little more than I wanted to admit, and asked her to connect me to the phone company's after-hours service line. When a woman answered, I explained where I was and asked whether they had anyone near Redfield Hollow that night. She said, "No, ma'am. We brought our trucks back in around 9 when the storm got worse. Nobody has been sent anywhere near Redfield Hollow tonight." I stood there holding the receiver while the man's flashlight moved along the outside wall. For a second, I could not think of anything to say. Then I asked, "Are you sure nobody would be working with another crew?" The woman said, "Not on that line. If someone is at your property saying we sent them, I need you to stay inside and..." The phone went silent. Not static, not a weak connection. Silence. I pressed the receiver switch several times. Nothing. The dial tone was gone. I slowly lowered the phone and looked toward the west wall. The flashlight had stopped moving. That was when I understood that the man circling my father's cabin was not who he said he was. I did not open the door or confront him. I thought about how far away the nearest help actually was, how the roads out there turned to mud in weather like this, and how being alone at the end of a dirt road meant I needed to think clearly. I blew out one of the lamps so the kitchen looked darker from outside and watched through a narrow gap in the curtain. A minute later, the man came back around to the porch. He said, "Line looks fine from what I can tell. Might just be the weather." I answered, "Thank you for checking. I think I'm all set for the night." He did not leave. He stood there for a moment with rain running from the edge of his hood. Then he said, "Your dad kept a good woodpile, tight and square along that east wall. Man knew what he was doing." The back of my neck went cold. The telephone box was on the west side. The woodpile was behind the shed on the east side, completely hidden from the road and porch. There had been no reason for him to walk over there. I had not told him anything about my father's woodpile. I said, "I should get back inside." He answered, "Storm's bad. Wouldn't want to be out on these roads tonight. Offer still stands if you want me to check anything else." I kept the door shut between us and asked, "You said dispatch had this address on file. How long have you worked this route?" He said, "Long enough." There was something flat in the way he answered, like a man closing a subject rather than answering a question. Then he added, "Long enough to know most of the places out this way, even the ones set back off the road like this." That stayed with me. Someone servicing telephone lines needed to know where the lines ran. He did not need to talk about isolated cabins as though he knew them personally. I told him again that I was fine. I listened until I heard his boots move down the porch steps. Then silence. I waited by the window. The truck at the edge of the clearing did not move. I could not call anyone because the phone line was gone. My own car was parked beside the front porch, only a few yards from where I had last seen him. My father's pickup was inside the shed behind the cabin, out of view from the road. I decided I was not going to wait there to find out what happened next. I gathered my coat, my father's flashlight, and the pickup keys. Then I went through the back door, the one that faced away from the porch and the road. The rain had not let up. I crossed the short distance to the shed and pulled the door open as quietly as I could. I climbed into the truck, and my hands were shaking badly enough that it took me 2 tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine caught. I did not wait to see whether anyone had heard it. I backed out of the shed and drove toward the dirt road, mud kicking behind the tires and branches slapping against the windshield. When I passed the place where his truck had been parked, it was gone. With the rain hammering the roof of the pickup and the wind moving through the trees, I realized an engine farther down the road could easily have disappeared beneath all that noise. The road out was worse than I remembered it. Ruts were filling with runoff, and the headlights caught sheets of rain coming almost sideways across the windshield. Twice, the back of the pickup slid toward the edge of the road before I slowed down and let it settle onto firmer ground. I kept checking the mirror. There was nothing behind me except darkness and rain. I did not stop until I reached the general store at the crossroads. It was closed for the night, but there was a payphone bolted to the wall outside beneath a small metal awning. I called the local station from there and explained what had happened. An officer met me at the store not long afterward. Once the worst of the storm had passed, another officer followed him back toward the cabin. They found the telephone box on the west wall with the cover sitting slightly crooked. One connection inside had been pulled loose, which explained why the phone had suddenly gone silent. They also found several deep impressions in the mud along the side of the cabin. Most were already softening in the rain, but a few beneath the trees were still visible. Farther back, the ground had been disturbed in a line leading toward the old logging road. The officers could not follow every step in that weather, but they believed someone had approached or left the property from that direction instead of using the main road. The telephone company confirmed that nobody had been assigned to our cabin that night or at any point that week. There was no outside service crew working our line either. Whatever the man had told me on the porch had been invented. The officers also looked at the tire marks near the old logging road that I had noticed that afternoon. The rain had already damaged most of them, but enough remained for one officer to tell me a vehicle had used that turnoff recently. He could not say whether it was the same truck I had seen that night, only that somebody had been using a road most people had little reason to take. 2 days later, before I left town, I stopped at a small property office near the center of Redfield Hollow. One of the officers had suggested asking whether anyone had recently shown unusual interest in the cabin. The office handled seasonal cabins and rural properties throughout the area, even places that were not actively for rent. A woman behind the counter searched through their inquiry cards and found one from July. Someone had called asking whether the Whitfield cabin near the old logging road might ever be available for a seasonal stay. The cabin had never been offered for rent. The woman had simply told the caller that it was private property and ended the conversation. The card listed a name I did not recognize. The woman remembered the call only vaguely. She said it had been a man's voice, polite and calm, asking several questions about the cabin and the surrounding land before losing interest once she made it clear the place was not available. I asked whether he had said why he wanted that particular cabin. She looked through the notes again, then she read one line she had written near the bottom. Caller seems familiar with property. Asked whether owner's family still visits. I remember staring at those words. If the July caller and the man on my porch were the same person, then his interest in that cabin had started months before I ever decided to spend a week there. But there was no way to prove they were the same person. I told the officer about the inquiry card. He said it was worth keeping with everything else, but a name written on an old property inquiry was not enough to identify the man who had come to the cabin that night. They would keep the information on file and contact me if anything new turned up. Nothing ever did. I never went back to the cabin after that. My mother sold it the following spring to a family from Burlington who wanted a quiet place for the summers. For a long time, I told myself the man on the porch had simply picked an isolated cabin at random. Maybe he saw lights in the windows. Maybe he noticed somebody was staying there. Maybe the woodpile comment only meant he had wandered farther around the property than he should have. Those explanations were easier to live with.